Good morning. And what a gorgeous summer morning it really, really is. So happy together we are this morning in this community of love. I am just so excited to tell you that the 7 steps towards spiritual illumination are going to go on a little bit further because I found myself working more earnestly this week with the first 3, and today we will cover 4 and 5 after reviewing briefly 1 through 3. So I don't expect that anybody objects to that. I know for myself, some of my greatest learning comes in what I call learning by contrast, where I can see where I no longer live to appreciate where I am now. And so thank you for that understanding. And the top title this morning, Yearning to Know God's Will, is inspired by Unity's spiritual power that we focus on during August, and that's the spiritual faculty within each one of us of divine will. Last week, I reviewed for myself the huge difference between willingness and willfulness. And I suppose as we yearn to discern the will of God for each of us, the first step is to be aware that willfully will not do it, but willingly will. I'd like to open before we metaphysically look at a scripture that has informed my message for me today, and I pray always that it's a blessing for all of us gathered in community. I'd like to share with you the first thing I read this morning on waking, and it's about enlightenment, and it's about spiritual growth and moving toward the light. And it is a brief inspiration from Dr. David Hawkins. He writes, humor is a means of detaching or recontextualizing the events of life. Humor is a means of detaching or recontextualizing the events of life. Humor is a way of being lighthearted and of wearing the world like a loose garment. Humor leads to compassion for the totality of human life. It is humor that reveals the option, and I might say open to every one of us right now. Humor reveals the option that one can play at life without getting involved in it as though it were an exhausting life and death struggle. So there we go. We release and relinquish and renounce life as a life and death struggle, and we open to humor as one pathway for sure to enlightenment. I know I've shared with some of you how for years it used to puzzle me when I learn from Hawkins' videos that he would, unrelated to anything, break into laughter in the middle of his teaching. So of course I appreciate now how enlightened he truly was, that laughter would just spill out of him. So on the note of humor, let me just preface a couple of riddles by ensuring you that I do not spend a lot of time on these riddles. And also, as you come to understand my need to practice this form of teaching called telling jokes, that part of my challenge is that so many of them go over my head. So that's sort of based on how I choose them, is that I understand them. So the first one is, all of them actually have to do with our topic today about reaching illumination. Spiritual illumination. And the first one says, what type of email attains enlightenment? It's the one that has no attachment, of course. The second riddle is, why couldn't the donut reach enlightenment? Well, because it was already holy, right? Yes. And finally, I don't think this is my favorite, but at least I understand it. What do you call a rat who has reached enlightenment? A Buddha pest. Yeah, I know. That one's a little mixed, isn't it? Oh my goodness, as I center myself and receive the message that Spirit has for me and that I am humbled and privileged to share with you, I give a heart of gratitude to the indwelling Spirit in the heart for spiritual growth, understanding of the faculty of will. As we gather this morning yearning to know God's will, I would like to look by way of introduction at 2 verses from the book of John, chapter 5, verses 33 and 34. Sorry, chapter 4. So this is John chapter 4, verses 31 to 34. And it reads, during the interval, his students begged him, saying, "Teacher, eat." But he said to them, "I have meat to eat, of which you do not know." And the disciples said amongst themselves, "What, did any man bring him something to eat?" And Jesus said, "My meat is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish his work." So during the week, this reference to meat sent me into some really interesting explorations of meat, especially in Eastern culture. Those of you who are familiar with Fillmore's metaphysical interpretation of meat, perhaps comply and agree with his. I don't necessarily. I'll share it with you and then I'll tell you what allowed me to just open my mind to other ways and let go of perceptions that are at all limited. So Fillmore says meat eating stimulates the sense man and interferes with the development of spiritual power. And so we, at least I, have always understood why. Those of you who've been to the village in Lee's Summit in Missouri know that a vegetarian diet in the kitchen is always available. And certainly many truth students with wonderful determination are vegetarians. Early in my training, I remember bringing that question to Reverend Ruth at the urban school. And she said something to me, which I have always remembered when I said, "So Reverend Ruth, this thing about the Fillmores being vegetarian, do you think it's important for all of us on the path to be vegetarian?" And out of character for her, she didn't pause. And she said, "Rosalind, I assure you that what goes into your mouth will always be far less important than what comes out of it." So I have retained her wisdom, and certainly for each of us, it's a different experience about meat. But what I love in terms of metaphysical interpretation or understanding of the word meat, it simply refers to spiritual nourishment. And certainly the master teacher was referring to the spiritual food, the spiritual nourishment of which he could partake continuously because of his unbroken consciousness with God, of his awareness unbroken, of his oneness with God. And so to begin this morning, just with a quick review of the 3 steps that we looked at last week, In the Eastern traditions, I find it really helpful and important that through 5, 6, 7, or 8,000 years of observing humanity, they determined that these 7 stages or 7 experiences are common to all humanity. And so I'm grateful for them as I yield to its teaching. You know, maybe all of you remember coming to truth, to a new thought center or to a unity center the first time. And perhaps you were there as I was, to heal, to transform, or to bring about some kind of a change or a shift in circumstances, in the life that I was living. It didn't take very long to understand that prayer in the new thought or unity way is very different from what I had understood prayer to be, and that praying from the frequency or from the vibrational level of the situation that was in my physical material life simply meant that I would continue to experience more of that situation. And if there is a change or a transformation in doing that, certainly the tendency then was to just move on to the next thing that needed to be changed or transformed. Along the spiritual path, if we really are yearning to know God's will of good for us, and once we yield and surrender, we recognize that we're much more interested in the law governing that shift, that change. What is it that does the healing? What is active behind that transformation? And so it is that in that process, we begin to release all desires, all attachments, and we rest instead, and this is how I experience it in my life, is resting instead in whatever degree of awareness I have reached of my inseparability from that law, from God, from love, from source, whatever term you might use to refer to the source of all life. You know, metaphysical teachers over the span of the last 130 years that certainly Charles and Myrtle Fillmore taught, they have led us away from early language which spoke about seeking God, searching for God, recognizing that no seeking and no searching is required, necessary, or even possible, frankly, because God cannot be absent in us, nor can we be really lost to God, except when we willfully, deliberately, from our human small self will power, lose awareness of that oneness, lose awareness of our inseparability from God. We know, as we covered last week, that this breath, this spirit of life, this source, is closer to us than hands and feet, and then the breath that we breathe. And so with this spiritual gift and recognizing that we are showing up willing to know God's will for us, and even presenting a heart that is open and receptive, and hence my word yearning, that yearning is present to know God's will. And in looking at these Eastern teachings that emerged from thousands of years of observing humanity, for me, having these 7 steps listed as reflective of patterns that I've been through and that I will go through, I find them practical and helpful because they call me back moment by moment to asking myself, am I using human willpower here, or am I yielding, trusting, allowing, as Mark said in the opening inspirational reading, trusting that that higher will move in and through me as I allow it. As I mentioned in the beginning, looking at the first 3 stages can be a type of recognizing where we have grown from where we might be now. We must choose the will of God. That's the first thing, really, is to be aware of what we are doing when we are willing. When we are willing, we're deciding to allow a higher divine will to guide us on a sure path to greater peace, poise, and lasting transformation. Within, illumination comes closer to us as we live in an unbroken, fluid awareness that I am made of light. That light defines me, and that light knows my need even before I ask. So resting in that, just breathe that in, that willingness for a moment. Just see any resistance flowing out of the mind, body, and spirit as we present ourselves willing in a new way, in the new person that each of us is this morning, to revisit those first 3 steps that some of us may still live in or have come through or recognize. You know, something came up last week. I don't know if it was right after service about how, you know, isn't it true that we go back and forth among all of them? I don't really think so. I believe that if we are surrendered and yielded to the will of God, and if our desire is to align with God's greatest good for us, there will not be slippage all the time. You know why? Because my experience suggests that I start to recognize how the temptation to be willful shows up. How I can still see on the periphery of my mind the temptation to use my willpower, and pretty soon repeatedly releasing it, recognizing it, and saying no to it. I will to will thy will, Father. We move into each next stage. So you'll remember that the first stage is unconsciousness. And for each of these 5 stages that I'm going to go through today, you'll recognize 2 subcategories, I think, from last week. First, I will tell you the name of the stage, okay? Then I will look at some of the symptoms that help me identify the stage that I'm living in at this moment, the stage of moving myself with yielding to God's will for me closer to illumination, right? So for each stage, I'll tell you the name, then I'll share the symptoms, and then I'll also share the behaviors characteristic of that stage so that I can look at myself and say, oh yeah, I experienced that, hence the symptoms, right? And look at the behaviors and go, oh, I remember when I did that all the time. I still do it. Or, oh, I haven't done that in a while. Whatever works for each one of us. So in this first stage, in my language, I call it being asleep. So the Eastern traditions call it unconsciousness. Here's some of the symptoms. We completely identify with the mind and physical body to the extent that in that stage, we actually believed that we were a mind-body being. Like, that's really how we define our existence. We thought we were a mind and a physical body. It's easier, I think, to recognize unconsciousness by looking at these symptoms. This is how things showed up. We had symptoms of rigid beliefs. Sometimes those rigid beliefs would lead us to apathy, boredom, disillusionment. The behaviors or activities, characteristics of unconsciousness is that we were in stage 1 impelled by desires or whims in the outer. We were very survival oriented, right? So that's it for the review of the first one. We know that at that stage, the soul's life forces are asleep. They're dormant. Stage 2, you'll remember, was dysfunctional self-consciousness, which the name alone is a little bit concerning for me at first, because I think, wow, the key there is small s, self-consciousness. So there's some awakening, but it's dysfunctional. It's characterized by suffering conflicted emotional states. Behaviors here, oh wow, really recognizable when I look at the past, obsessive, dependent, emotional relationships, a lot of complaining, fault finding with life, with people, with everything, right? So in terms of our behavior in stage 2, it is governed by subconscious conditioning. I find that to be really important because we spend a lot of time in truth circles talking about accessing the subconscious, which is really driving the bus. And so really I can understand how stage 2 dysfunctionality is based on the fact that the soul's life forces are only partially tapped into or awake. You'll remember stage 3 is the one that we closed with last week, and it was just a little bit above number 2, dysfunctional. It becomes functional self-consciousness, and it's a higher vibration than dysfunctioning small self-consciousness. Certainly it's more healthy minded, but it is still egocentrically governed. And so the human will is still pretty much at play. Here's some of the symptoms. There starts to be partial understanding or comprehension of the reality of God, but it is still mixed. So in stage 3, our understanding of the reality of God is still intermingled with traditional, beliefs. You know how we talk about healing, past, conditioning, whatever that might be. And so that's still here in stage 3. Interesting. I feel that I can look back really readily and see myself in stage 3 when it comes to the behaviors. The behaviors seem really, really distinctive for me here because they are all about more power or more understanding of God even as a way to maneuver, control, manufacture, or even, here's the spiritual bypass, in the name of understanding life better. However, the behavior in this stage 3 where we left off, the control or the power that we hope to get in stage 3 when we're praying and starting to surrender is for the goal of personal circumstances still shifting and of the projects or the goals of the world. And so we can see in stage 3 where we left off last week that the soul forces are gradually emerging. This is a good juncture to stop for a moment before we go into stages 4 and 5. And to notice what I said a few minutes ago about, is it really true that once we have moved through one stage, we can, for example, slip all the way back to stage one. Well, that's where the use of willingness versus willfulness informs a choice. And we're making choices in mind all the time. We're making decisions, and not just about what to think, but more importantly in my life, making choices and decisions about what I really value and what I really believe. So choosing what I value, especially if it's yielding or surrendering to a higher will than willpower, then that's a choice. And what I have found is stage 3 is when we can first start to recognize the particular ways that our ego or our small self shows up to try and trick us. And I think that's not often acknowledged, that we can fall backwards on our way to spiritual illumination because we fail to recognize the particular ways in which the ego can seduce us. And so I know for me, the hallmarks or the trademarks or the signs that the ego is on the scene is that I think I know. So you hear that? Knowledge is of God. It's not of my small will, my small self. So whenever I find myself even, just briefly starting to venture into thinking that I know something, oh my goodness, especially if it's about another person's thinking, God forbid, or their actions, then I'm officially in the territory of the ego. I have completely given over to willpower and control of thinking that I can know something, which I don't have to remind us, thinking that we know is a direct path to judging, and then we have left the will of God. And so for me, this is a practical way that I gauge my spiritual growth, is to notice how temptation shows up for me. And of course, we are unique individual expressions of the divine. And my learning has suggested that the ways we get tempted are as unique and individualistic as each of us is. And so there is really the personal part of spiritual growth, which is that each of us has the responsibility of looking at how we get tempted, looking at how willpower, the human will, engages sometimes before we even know it. And so those are the first 3. And it seems to me that because we're moving from unconsciousness to dysfunctional consciousness to then some consciousness, which is functional, it feels like the next step is one that can be a little more difficult to recognize in ourselves, not just because of the symptoms and the behaviors, but also if we look at the characteristics of it. And the Eastern 7 steps call the 4th step super consciousness. So in metaphysics, whenever we hear the word super, we know that it just means above or over. And so in this stage, most simply put, for my understanding, I think of it as my consciousness having been raised above or lifted over the seduction of appearances, the needing to judge, comprehend, analyze what something is looking like in the outer, as opposed to yielding to a higher awareness, a super consciousness. So that's really how I would define the difference from the first 3 phases. Is, for me, those are various levels of wakefulness, with the exception of the first one where we were fast asleep, right? But now, as the steps or the evolution towards spiritual illumination becomes a fourth recognizable stage, then we know that these, I'm going to call them awarenesses, these knowings that are of spirit emerge during meditation, during silence, during contemplation. And then we know that we are in the superconsciousness phase of our unfoldment, because what we feel and receive in meditation or prayer or silence is influential when we are no longer in prayer, meditation, contemplation. So that's a really important point for me. So I'm going to say it again. Superconsciousness emerges during prayer, meditation, silence, and contemplation. So the first step, of course, is to dedicate those 4 or 5 times in our day when we pause and fill up our spiritual tank by resting even a few moments in that superconsciousness state. Because superconsciousness, once again, emerges during the silence, during prayer, during meditation, and we will rest more consistently in superconsciousness when what emerges during that time is influential in our everyday, what the French call la quotidienne de la vie, the everyday details of living. Wow. So I am so excited now to look at the symptoms that help me say, wow, how consistent is this superconsciousness stage of my path? And here's the symptoms. There is a diminished sense of independent selfhood, which for me is another way of saying increased awareness of oneness, right? So whatever way it lands on you that can be most easily integrated, I'll say that symptom of super consciousness again. And it is that the illusional sense of an independent selfhood diminishes as self, capital S, God self realization increases. Wow. So what about the behaviors? And folks, this is where the buck stops. Really and truly, this is where in Unity we are blessed with the directive, I believe, to apply this stuff, which can seem very abstract. And here we come to the behaviors that indicate to us that we might be living in a state of superconsciousness. And here goes. We wisely, there's the divine wisdom, and here's the choice. We wisely choose activities and relationships. Do you know what? That in itself is enough homework for me for the rest of my life. To wisely choose relationships and activities. Now, coming to another symptom, maybe you remember, and maybe it wasn't your experience, but for me, in stage 2 and 3, I had a huge story I would tell myself, about why you can't release certain personalities. It's kind of like a holier than thou attitude. Oh, well, what would Jesus do? Well, guess what? I'm not Jesus yet. And we need to make wise choices when it comes to relationships and to activities. And that shows up for me as so many people that I talk to, especially in the last year and a half, who are on this path and who watch the news and who think that I must look like some kind of ostrich to them because I choose not to subject myself. Can I just guarantee you one thing? And I'm not telling you not to watch the news. Believe me, I'm telling you what works for me. in as much as I avoid the news, I have an opportunity every day. At least one person wants to tell it to me. So there we go with the choosing the relationships wisely. Because if I say that I am on a path towards living in a consciousness of light, why would that stuff appeal to me? It wouldn't. And that's really what this fourth stage of superconsciousness is characterized by. That those activities and those relationships are experienced without compulsion. Okay. So it's not that I want to tell somebody, oh, don't tell me about the news, or it's not that I'm attached to whatever they're enjoying from the news. No, those relationships that might show up, those activities are experienced without compulsion and attachment. It calls up for me the scripture, when Jesus is teaching in the temple and somebody tells him, dude, your mom and your brother out here. And he says, really? Call no man your brother or mother. And this for me is an attribute. It is a liberation of consciousness when we live in the fourth state of spiritual unfoldment, of super consciousness, that we recognize those relationships are temporal, they're temporary, they're of the world, and they are not the ultimate relationship. And so it's up to us to wisely choose activities, and the next step, to release personalities which no longer appeal to us as we move toward the light. And that's a hard one. And having done that more than once and being on the brink of perhaps being called to decide or to choose according to my guidance under the will of God to do so again, I can say that the ego is not shrieking at me about a story of why I ought not to choose more wisely. The other characteristics that I didn't mention of this fourth stage of superconsciousness is there is an intense love of knowledge, of learning, of knowing more. This is interestingly enough in the literature around these 7 stages, which I've just condensed for the purposes of this message, which is about to end. The word willingness only shows up in the fourth stage, in the superconsciousness stage. And they write about it this way. In the fourth stage, superconsciousness, willingness shows up, and it pertains to being willing to live righteously and to actively engage in spiritual practices. So you'll remember the emergence of superconsciousness during meditation, to actively participate in meditation becomes a precursor to allowing the gifts of that time in the quiet to influence the rest of our lives. And so, maybe you can think of a relationship recently that has given you the opportunity to renounce mental and emotional attachments to it. I have at least one big one and 2 or 3 minor invitations to really look at myself and how I might still be attaching to either outcome or whatever, but not being aligned with the divine will. And here's the rest of stage 4, and perhaps you'll recognize this. I know that I look at the 2 people that I do, sort of feel mentored by, who I think if they're not spiritual illumined, I know they're people I can learn from. And these 2 traits are evident in their responses to life. One is that solitude is enjoyable for them. And the other characteristic is that they have very much a non-engaged, I guess, attitude towards the circumstances of life. Some of you have heard me say that in the case of one of my mentors, his approach to any circumstance, situation, dilemma, or whatever that someone might bring, his response is, it doesn't matter. Simply, it doesn't matter. And so in the fourth stage, we no longer find appealing lifestyle habits that are self-sabotaging. We no longer participate, we can't, in unwholesome conversation or company of what is ego-directed personalities, unethical behavior. Aspiring to liberating our consciousness becomes a focus. And so we seek above all the freedom that comes from super consciousness, which is the oneness with God. And so we crave whatever feels just, whatever feels sincere. And they do allow for this in the teachings, that if in the fourth stage of super consciousness, some of the characteristics from 2 and 3 pop up, then, or they leak through, then these do have the potential to interfere with spiritual progress towards the light. But I guess for me, the question becomes what I've already emphasized, which is recognizing those and how they show up for me and how they are transcended and how they are overcome is the key to today's message. Those moments of backsliding are overcome by living in the superconscious awareness that I am choosing activities, relationships, beliefs, values, priorities. And more importantly, I suppose, or just as important, is that I am engaging my willingness and my receptivity to be open to the divine will. In the last stage, which is the fourth one, we're not going to talk about 6 and 7 today. So this is the penultimate one. Stage 4, and I will only go as far into 5 as I'm guided, I suppose. But in stage 4, the good news is that the soul's life forces are awakened and flow upward through the spinal pathway. So we've all heard about the Kundalini being activated. In the fourth stage, the soul's life forces are awakened and they flow upward through the spinal pathway into what they call in the East, the higher brain centers. Wow. So there we have it. The review of 1, 2, and 3, I hope was meaningful. It is for me. The new stage, which was 4 of super consciousness, will guide and lead us directly next Sunday into cosmic consciousness stages. And I'll just quickly tell you that when we're in the cosmic stage of consciousness, most of the time, we apprehend the universe as an interactive, the interaction of all cosmic forces coming from God's being. All perceptions and realizations during stage 5 will be transcended during meditation. And so let me close with the understanding that the first 4 stages do characterize readiness for the last 3 stages of 5, 6, and 7, which we will look at next Sunday. So stage 5, I will just repeat, is the cosmic consciousness, which we will look at next Sunday. stage 6, which precedes enlightenment and follows cosmic consciousness, is God realization. So these are all words, folks, but what's important is that we internalize the truth that there are noticeable, observable, practical ways to move ourselves forward toward spiritual light, illumination, and towards living in an unbroken awareness of our oneness with God. And so it is. Amen. And now we prepare for even a few brief moments of contemplation, refreshment, renewal, revitalization, and resting in the heart center with willingness to receive, to hear, to will the will of the divine. And so notice your posture, your breath. As we move into this silence, we are ever so grateful for the will of the divine being received willingly in my heart. I rest in that willingness in the silence now, open, receptive, responsive, and obedient to God's will.